What's up, everybody? We're going to be talking about the phage, the soch, and either the Carlist or comrades. Because that's what I got to do to have a grown up conversation around here. And I'll just tell you right off the bat 90% of the reason I'm doing this video is because the people that throw this term around all of the time don't have the vocabulary comprehension to even understand this doctrine. You will see very clearly that he is speaking to the adults in the room. Nowadays, everything is intentionally dumbed down to get an emotional response from the most uninformed members of society. And you can tell that he's gotten to the point that he realizes that no matter how much you placate some people, it's never going to be enough. The goalpost is going to move, and they're always going to find a new victim. Now, let me make this clear up front. Just because I do a video about what somebody else says, that doesn't mean I agree with everything they say. He actually does say a lot of things that I do agree with. And then there's some things that I don't. But here's the deal. A Chester can make 100 statements, and I can agree with 99 of them. But that one statement he made about the little niños is going to outweigh everything else, and I'm going to say he needs a rope and a tree. But even in that situation, I still agree with the other 99 things. What matters is if something is true or false, right or wrong. It doesn't matter who said it. So the idea that you should ignore everything somebody says, especially a world leader, because you heard they were a blank, is really immature. And I listen to things I disagree with all the time. Keep your friends close and your enemies closer. I learn all kinds of stuff about who I think are causing the problems. First, they leave this out of the textbooks, but you really need to understand that this was the state of Europe 100 years ago. There were literally social revolutions everywhere. Now, take a wild guess which two men squashed these bugs and threw them out. The biggest monsters in history. This map right here tells you everything you need to know about why you were taught history the way you were taught history. It's because they print the newspapers and textbooks. So I am no expert on Benito. I'm not sure if we can even talk about him here. But I do know that they literally fought the Soch out in the street. I'm not going to get into what's justified and what's not. But to him, the idea was rebuilding the ancient Roman Empire. The name phage comes from the Roman fascia. This is an ancient symbol of unity and strength. Separated, you can easily break any one of those twigs, but lashed together, then you're strong enough to chop down a tree. And anybody still running around saying this is an earthquake machine needs to get their head checked. Some of you guys know what I'm talking about. All you really need to know going into this is the same moral degradation attack on society that we're seeing today was going on 100 years ago. It's that simple, and I mean down to every last detail. Their whole methodology is to inflict enough pain that people will accept any change. So just know that's what they were up against, and they took a hardline stance. It's easy to be a Monday morning quarterback or a YouTube commenter, but I don't see anybody out there solving the problems we're up against today. So here we go, and like I said, just listen to the language being used. It's just night and day difference from how anyone speaks to the public today. I am actually old enough to remember when the news used to speak to the public like they were adults, but that's long gone. When in the now distant March of 1919, speaking through the columns of the Popolo d'Italia, I summoned to Milan the surviving interventionists who had intervened and who had followed me ever since the foundation of the phage of revolutionary action in January 1915. I had in mind no specific doctrinal program. The only doctrine of which I had practical experience was that of Soch, from until the winter of 1914, nearly a decade. My experience was that both of a follower and a leader, but not that of doctrinal experience. My doctrine during that period had been the doctrine of action. Now, he did take over by action, as he put it, and I'm not condoning or denouncing what he did. It's just what happened. A uniform, universally accepted doctrine of Soch had not existed since 1905, when the revisionist movement headed by Bernstein arose in Germany, countered by the formation in the seesaw of tendencies of a left revolutionary movement which in Italy never quitted the field of phrases. Slogan after slogan. Does that sound familiar? Field of phrases. Whereas in the case of the Russian Soc, it became the prelude to the Bolsh. Reformism, revolutionism, centrism, the very echo of that terminology is dead. While in the great river of phage, one can trace currents which had their source in Sorel and a bunch of other people who from 1904 to 1914 brought a new note into the Italian Soc environment, previously emasculated and chloroformed by the fornicating with Giolotti's party. When the war ended in 1919, Soc as a doctrine was already dead. It continued to exist only as a grudge, especially in Italy, where its only chance lay in inciting to reprisals against the men who had willed the war and who were to be made to pay for it. If the bourgeoisie, I then said, believe that they have found in us their lightning conductors, they are mistaken. We must go towards the people. We wish the working classes to accustom themselves to the responsibilities of management so that they may realize that it is no easy matter to run a business. So I'm going to stop right there. And like I said, guys, just imagine everything that's going on right now in society. They have convinced people that aren't qualified to run a cash register that, well, you deserve everything he's got. I mean, sure, he's been in the business 30 years and spends till 10 o'clock at night working on material lists, but you deserve to be making $25 an hour to show up and play on your phone. So seriously, when I hear how he addresses some problems, I can already see where he's coming from. And honestly, I don't know enough about the man to decide whether I like him or not. So you can at least hold your judgment until I make up my mind here. We will fight both technical and spiritual rearguardism. Now that the succession of the regime is open, we must not be faint-hearted. We must rush forward. If the present regime is to be superseded, we must take its place. The right of succession is ours, for we urge the country to enter the war and we led it to victory. The existing forms of political representation cannot satisfy us. We want direst representation of the several interests. It may be objected that this program implies a return to the guilds. No matter. I therefore hope this assembly will accept the economic claims advanced by national syndicalism. Now, he goes on a really long-winded paragraph about how the doctrine was forged in the trials of Dub 1 and born out of the necessity for action. Then he continues, phage is now clearly defined not only as a regime, but as a doctrine. This means that phage, exercising its critical faculties on itself and on others, has studied from its own special standpoint and judged by its own standards all the problems affecting the material and intellectual interests now causing such grave anxiety to the nations of the world, and is ready to deal with them by its own policies. First of all, as regards the future development of mankind and quite apart from all present political considerations, phage does not, generally speaking, believe in the possibility or utility of perpetual peace. It therefore discards pacifism as a cloak for cowardly supine renunciation in contradistinction to self-sacrifice. Now, just imagine somebody coming out today and saying, hey, guess what, guys? We have enemies. Yeah, we're not living somewhere over the rainbow. This is the real world. You know what? I want peace just as much as anybody else, but guess what? There's people out there that won't let us have that. And they're the ones telling you that they really care for you. So this idea of peace at all costs is really just us standing aside and letting them get away with everything. And I'll just tell you, my grandpa's generation, you didn't mess with them, not after what they've been through. And he is speaking here fresh out of Dub 1. War alone keys up all human energies to their maximum tension and sets the seal of nobility on those peoples who have the courage to face it. All other tests are substitutes, which never place a man face to face with himself before the alternative of life or death. Therefore, all doctrines which postulate peace at all costs are incompatible with phage. Equally foreign to the spirit of phage, even if accepted as useful in meeting special political situations, are all internationalistic or league superstructures which, as history shows, crumble to the ground whenever the heart of nations is deeply stirred by sentimental, idealistic, or practical considerations. Phage carries the anti-pacifistic attitude into the life of the individual. Quote, "I don't care a damn," the proud motto of the fighting squad scrawled by a wounded man on his bandages, is not only an act of philosophic stoicism, it sums up a doctrine which is not merely political. It is evidence of a fighting spirit which accepts all risks. It signifies new style of Italian life. The phage accepts and loves life. He rejects and despises self-offing as cowardly. Life, as he stands it, means duty, elevation, conquest. Life must be lofty and full. It must be lived for oneself, but above all for others, both nearby and far off, present and future. The population policy of the regime is the consequence of these premises. The phage loves his neighbor, but the word neighbor does not stand for some vague and unsizable conception. Love of one's neighbor does not exclude necessary educational severity. Still less does it exclude differentiation and rank. Phage will have nothing to do with universal embraces. As a member of the community of nations, it looks other people straight in the eye. It is vigilant and on its guard. It follows others in all their manifestations and notes any changes in their interests. And it does not allow itself to be deceived by mutable and fallacious appearances. I gotta say, I'm liking the guy. This idea that we have to accept everybody is total trash. No, I don't want a bunch of squatters next door shooting up and stealing my lawnmower. I don't have to accept that. So I'll chalk that up as a point in my book because I'm all for holding society to a higher standard. Trust me, if gutter trash is what you want, then that's what you're gonna get. And that's what some people want. Speaking of, such a conception of life makes phage the resolute negation of the doctrine underlying the so-called scientific and Carlist soch, the doctrine of historic materialism, which would explain the history of mankind in terms of the class struggle and by changes in the processes and instruments of production to the exclusion of all else. So you can already tell they've been agitating the have-nots by complaining that the productive members of society are living good lives, because the only tool in the comrades' toolbox is to pit one class against another. And they always go after the disgruntled dregs of society. But you can tell he ain't even talking to them, not with this vocabulary, that the vicissitudes of economic life, discoveries of raw materials, new technical processes, and scientific inventions have their importance no one denies, but that they suffice to explain human history to the exclusion of other factors is absurd. Phage believes now and always in sanctity and heroism, that is to say, in acts in which no economic motive, remote or immediate, is at work. Having denied historic materialism, which sees in men mere puppets on the surface of history, appearing and disappearing on the crest of waves while in the depths of real directing forces move and work, phage also denies the immutable and irreparable character of the class struggle, which is the natural outcome of this economic conception of history. Above all, it denies that the class struggle is the preponderating agent in social transformations. Having this struck a blow at soch in the two main points of its doctrine, all that remains of it is the sentimental aspiration, old as humanity itself, toward social relations in which the suffering and sorrows of the humbler folk will be alleviated. But they just care so much about us. Anyway. But here again, phage rejects the economic interpretation of felicity as something to be secured socialistically, almost automatically, at a given stage of economic evolution when all will be assured a maximum of material comfort. Phage denies the materialistic conception of happiness as a possibility and abandons it to the economists of the mid-18th century. This means that phage denies the equation well-being equals happiness, which sees in men mere animals, content when they can feed and fatten, thus reducing them to a vegetative existence, pure and simple. I gotta say, what I love so much about this is the people that throw this term around as derogatory or an insult can't even comprehend what the man just said. I would pay money to see someone of this caliber just drag one of our modern talking heads through the coals. They would just be a smoldering pile of ash going, but we care about the little daisies. This next part might get a little uncomfortable for some people, but stick around, you'll learn something. After Soch, Phage trains its guns on the whole block of democratic ideologies and rejects both their premises and their practical applications and implements. Phage denies that numbers, as such, can be the determining factor in human society. It denies the right of numbers to govern by means of periodical consultations. It asserts the irredeemable, and fertile and beneficent inequality of men who cannot be leveled by any such mechanical or intrinsic device as universal suffrage. And sorry, but damn right, I don't need some crackhead in a city 200 miles away determining what's best for me. And like that Austrian guy pointed out, the two-party system is just a revolving door where one party has the power while the other just complains about everything they do, then they take power and do the same thing. There's perpetual opposition, but nothing ever changes. Democratic regimes may be described as those under which the people are, from time to time, deluded into the belief that they exercise sovereignty, while all the time real sovereignty resides in and is exercised by other and sometimes irresponsible and secret forces. Ouch. Democracy is a kingless regime infested by many kings who are sometimes more exclusive, tyrannical, and destructive than one, even if he be a tyrant. This explains why Phage, although for contingent reasons, it was Republican in tendency prior to 1922, abandoned that stand before the March on Rome, convinced that the form of government is no longer a matter of preeminent importance, and because the study of past and present monarchies and past and present republics shows that neither monarchy nor republic can be judged sub specie aeternitatis, but that each stands for a form of government expressing the political evolution, the history, the traditions, and the psychology of a given country. All right, you got me on that one. Had to look it up. Subspecie aeternitatis is from the perspective of eternity. And by the way, that's how educated people used to drop the hammer on us plebs. They'd just break out the Latin. Did you know that college entry requirements in the pre-Civil War South required you to be fluent in Latin and Greek just to get your foot in the door? That's not what you learned once you got there. That was the entrance requirement. Anyway, Phage has outgrown the dilemma monarchy versus republic, over which democratic regimes too long dallied, attributing all insufficiencies to the former and pronging the latter as a regime of perfection, whereas experience teaches that some republics are inherently reactionary and absolutist, while some monarchies accept the most daring political and social experiments. And you should know that this is right after the fall of all of the great monarchies, because that's what Soch has to do. It has to tear everything down to, quote, build back better. In one of his philosophic meditations, Renan, who had pre-Phage institutions, remarks, quote, reason and science are the products of mankind, but it is chimerical to seek reason directly for the people and through the people. It is not essential to the existence of reason that all should be familiar with it, and even if all had to be initiated, this could not be achieved through democracy, which seems fated to lead the extinction of all arduous forms of culture and all highest forms of learning. The maxim that society exists only for the well-being and freedom of the individuals composing it does not seem to be in conformity with nature's plans, which care only for the species and seem ready to sacrifice the individual. It is much to be feared that the last word of democracy, thus understood, and let me hasten to add that it is susceptible of a different interpretation, would be a form of society in which a degenerate mass would have no thought beyond that of enjoying the ignoble pleasures of the vulgar. Whoosh-a-bash. In rejecting democracy, Fage rejects the absurd conventional lie of political equalitarianism, the habit of collective irresponsibility, the myth of felicity and indefinite progress. Yeah, eternal economic growth is not a sound doctrine for society. It equates to the working class being servants to their taskmasters. This is a sensitive word here, so I'm just going to say humanism. If you're just listening, you need to look at the screen for a minute, but that's the actual term. Fage is definitely and absolutely opposed to the doctrines of humanism, both in the political and the economic sphere. The importance of humanism in the 19th century should not be exaggerated for present-day polemical purposes, nor should we make of one of the many doctrines which flourished in that century a religion for mankind for the present and for all time to come. Humanism really flourished for 15 years only. It arose in 1830 as a reaction to the Holy Alliance, which tried to force Europe to recede further back than 1789. It touched its zenith in 1848 when even Pius IX was a humanist. Its decline began immediately after that year. If 1848 was a year of light and poetry, 1849 was a year of darkness and tragedy. The Roman Republic was killed by a sister republic, that of France. In that same year, Karl, in his famous manifesto, launched the gospel of Soch. There's a very long paragraph about Napoleon III here. I'm going to skip past that. The humanist century, after piling up innumerable Gordian knots, tried to cut them with the sword of the Dub One. Never has any religion claimed so cruel a sacrifice. Were the gods of humanism thirsting for blood? Now humanism is preparing to close the doors of its temples, deserted by the peoples who feel that the agnosticism it professed in the sphere of economics and the indifferentism of which it has given proof in the sphere of politics and morals would lead the world to ruin in the future as they have done in the past. Now, he is correct that humanism, and remember, I'm substituting for the L word here, played a positive role in the history of mankind. But the humanism of the Enlightenment period is nothing like we have today. Almost everybody would have agreed with its original precepts, but when used as a tool to foment unrest, they have to keep moving the bar further and further. So now we're to the point that nobody knows what bathroom to use. This explains why all the political experiments of our day are anti-humanist, and it is supremely ridiculous to endeavor on this account to put them outside the pale of history, as though history were a preserve set aside for humanists and its adepts, as though humanism were the last word in civilization beyond which no one can go. So he sounds like someone who has seen and has had enough of the moral decay of society. The Fage negation of Soch, democracy, and humanism should not, however, be interpreted as implying a desire to drive the world backwards to positions occupied prior to 1789, a year commonly referred to as that which opened the democroliberal century. History does not travel backwards. Monarchical absolutism is of the past, and so is ecclesiolatry, dead and done for the feudal privileges and the division of society into closed, uncommunicating castes, echo chambers. Neither has the Fage conception of authority anything in common with that of a police-ridden state. A party governing a nation totalitarianly is a new departure in history. There are no points of reference nor of comparison. From beneath the ruins of humanist, Soch, and democratic doctrines, Fage extracts those elements which are still vital. It preserves what may be described as the acquired facts of history. It rejects all else. That is to say, it rejects the idea of a doctrine suited to all times and to all people. Granted, the 19th century was the century of all of the isms. This does not mean that the 20th century must also be the century of all of the isms. Political doctrines pass, nations remain. We are free to believe that this is the century of authority, a century tending to the right, a phage century. If the 19th century was the century of the individual, we are free to believe that this is the, quote, collective century, and therefore the century of the state. We were doing so good up until there. But here's the deal. Even the most staunch libertarian like me has to admit that some form of governance is required. Now, if we lived in a society of high moral fortitude, then possibly not. But we don't. There's all kinds of POSs out there, especially now that they've drugged society down to the level it's at. So while I disagree with the initial statement on this subject, I am going to hear him out. And honestly, I'm not so sure that we're better off now than we were in the time of monarchies. At least a royal family held itself to the highest of standards, and it's a fiction that they had absolute power. They still had to acquiesce to the aristocracy and the nobility, or it was an et tu brute situation. Okay, so the century of the state. It is quite logical for a new doctrine to make use of the still vital elements of other doctrines. No doctrine was ever born quite new and bright and unheard of. No doctrine can boast absolute originality. It is always connected with those which preceded it and those which will follow it. Thus, the scientific soch of Carl links up to the utopian soch of the Fouriers, the Owens, and the Saint-Simons. Thus, the humanism of the 19th century traces its origins back to the Illuministic movement of the 18th, and the doctrines of democracy to those of the encyclopedias. All doctrines aim at directing the activities of men towards a given objective, but these activities, in their turn, react on the doctrine, modifying and adjusting it to new needs or outstripping it. A doctrine must therefore be a vital act and not a verbal display, hence the pragmatic strain in phage, its will to power, its will to live, its attitude towards violins, and its value. The keystone of the phage doctrine is its conception of the state, of its essence, its functions, and its aims. For phage, the state is absolute, individuals and groups relative. Individuals and groups are admissible insofar as they come within the state. Instead of directing the game and guiding the material and moral progress of the community, the humanist state restricts its activities to recording results. The phage state is wide awake and has a will of its own. For this reason, it can be described as ethica. The state guarantees the internal and external safety of the country, but it also safeguards and transmits the spirit of the people, elaborated down the ages in its language, its customs, its faith. The state is not only the present, it is also the past and above all the future. Transcending the individual's brief spell of life, the state stands for the immanent conscience of the nation. The state educates the citizens to civility, makes them aware of their mission, urges them to unity. Its justice harmonizes their divergent interests. It transmits to future generations the conquests of the mind in the fields of science, art, law, human solidarity. It leads men up from the primitive tribal life to that highest manifestation of human power, imperial rule. The state hands down to future generations the memory of those who laid down their lives to ensure its safety or to obey its laws. It sets up as examples and records for future ages the names of the captains who enlarged its territory and of the men of genius who have made it famous. Whenever respect for the state declines and the disintegrating and centrifugal tendencies of individuals and groups prevail, nations are headed for decay. If humanism spells individualism, phage spells government. The phage state is, however, a unique and original creation. It is not reactionary but revolutionary, for it anticipates the solution of certain universal problems which have been raised elsewhere in the political field by the splitting up of parties, the usurpation of power by parliaments, the irresponsibility of assemblies, in the economic field by the increasingly numerous and important functions discharged by trade unions and trade associations with their disputes and ententes affecting both capital and labor, in the ethical field by the need felt for order, discipline, obedience to the moral dictates of patriotism. Phage desires the state to be strong and organic based on broad foundations of popular support. The phage state lays claim to rule in the economic field no less than in others. It makes its action felt throughout the length and breadth of the country by means of its corporative, social, and educational institutions and all the political, economic, and spiritual forces of the nation, organized in their respective associations, circulate within the state. A state based on millions of individuals who recognize its authority, feel its action, and are ready to serve its ends is not the tyrannical state of a medieval lording. It has nothing in common with the despotic states existing prior to or subsequent to 1789. Far from crushing the individual, the phage state multiplies his energies, just as in a regiment a soldier is not diminished but multiplied by the number of his fellow soldiers. The phage state organizes the nation, but it leaves the individual adequate elbow room. It has curtailed useless or harmful liberties while preserving those which are essential. In such matters, the individual cannot be the judge, but the state only. Okay, on paper that sounds great. Individual desires shouldn't outweigh the needs of a nation, but who determines what's best for the nation? He's basically describing a monarchy without the pedigree of nobility. The phage state is not indifferent to religious phenomena in general, nor does it maintain an attitude of indifference to Roman Catholics, the special positive religion of Italians. The state has not got a theology, but it has a moral code. The phage state sees in religion one of the deepest of spiritual manifestations, and for this reason, it not only respects religion, but defends and protects it. The phage state does not attempt, as did Robespierre at the height of the revolutionary delirium of the convention, to set up a god of its own, nor does it vainly seek, as does Bolsch, to efface God from the soul of man. Phage respects the God of ascetics, saints, and heroes, and it also respects God as conceived by the ingenious and primitive heart of the people, the God to whom their prayers are raised. The phage state expresses the will to exercise power and to command. Here the Roman tradition is embodied in a conception of strength. Imperial power, as understood by the phage doctrine, is not only territorial or military or commercial, it is also spiritual and ethical. An imperial nation, that is to say, a nation which directly or indirectly is a leader of others, can exist without the need of conquering a single square mile of territory. Phage sees in the imperialistic spirit, i.e., in the tendency of nations to expand, a manifestation of their vitality. In the opposite tendency, which would limit their interest to the home country, it sees a symptom of decadence. People who rise or re-arise are imperialistic. Renunciation is characteristic of dying peoples. The phage doctrine is that best suited to the tendencies and feelings of a people which, like the Italian, after lying fallow during centuries of foreign servitude, are now reasserting itself in the world. But imperialism implies discipline, the coordination of efforts, a deep sense of duty, and a spirit of self-sacrifice. This explains many aspects of the practical activity of the regime and the direction taken by many of the forces of the state, as also the severity which has to be exercised towards those who would oppose the spontaneous and inevitable movement of the 20th century. By agitating outgrown ideologies of the 19th century, ideologies rejected wherever great experiments in political and social transformations are being dared. Never before have the people thirsted for authority, direction, order, as they do now. If each age has its doctrine, then innumerable symptoms indicate that the doctrine of our age is the phage. That it is vital is shown by the fact that it has aroused a faith. That this faith has conquered souls is shown by the fact that phage can point to its fallen heroes and its martyrs. Phage has now acquired throughout the world that universality which belongs to all doctrines which by achieving self-expression represent a moment in the history of human thought. The end. Okay, bye. Just kidding. Okay, that was really long, but let's unpack this some. So he spoke volumes about what's wrong with all of the isms, but he said very little about a viable alternative. He's a military man, and that's an institution that relies on discipline and authority. And when the only tool in your toolbox is a hammer, then you make every problem to be a nail. The zeitgeist of the moment being that we've seen all of the disorder that comes with Soch, the polar opposite of which being rigid authoritarianism. And if that's your solution, then why not dust off the crown and just reinstate the monarchy? He says, never before have the peoples thirsted for authority, direction, and order as they do now. You can tell people are tired of the clown show, just like we are today. The Soch agenda is to tear down existing structures with the promise of eternal sunshine, but in practice, it creates chaos to the point that people are willing to accept any ideology that promises the slightest semblance of normalcy. The whole plan was that the people creating the chaos would be the ones to step in as savior, but a bunch of battle-hardened vets marched in and ousted the clowns from the show. Just imagine if somebody walked in right now and took all of the talking head propagandists, all of the people responsible for importing 20,000 unwanted visitors to a town of 60,000 that then started barbecuing their felines, all of the NGOs that have transported more chattel than the Underground Railroad, all of the people that are chemically and surgically turning little niños into little niñas and vice versa, all of the people that have laundered hundreds of billions of dollars and millions of lives through Eastern Europe and the Middle East. Just imagine if somebody came in and hauled all of them down to Guantanamo. They'd be a national hero. That doesn't mean they'd be a good administrator. Probably the opposite. Now, like I said earlier, I really don't know enough about him to form an overall opinion. I know he marched on Rome and took power in a very daring manner. I know he's painted as a tyrant, but I have looked into this part and I can't find any mass removal of opponents or citizens or anything like that. It's kind of hard to judge any leader for what they do in a wartime setting because everybody has to do bad things there. It's easy to say that, well, you shouldn't engage in it in the first place, but the alternative is sometimes your people getting off. If you're truly protecting your people, then I see that as a necessity, not like what we do today. Nobody's showing up, well, with gear at our shores. They're showing up, though. Some in history have taken the offensive posture to the extremes, but there's no killing fields of Cambodia associated with Benito that I know of. And pretty much anybody stacked up next to the comrades and their 100 million is going to look like a church boy. Now, like he said about the soldier scrolling, I don't care a damn on his bandages. He strikes me as a very stoic man from a stoic society. I mean, just look at our mafia. They're criminals and they hold themselves to a higher standard than most average people here. I don't say that thinking it applies to the entire society, but I think the men of stature are very stoic. And like he said, we're a nation not afraid to look other nations square in the eye. That's commendable. And the part about we pay attention to what somebody does and we pay attention when they change that. Our modern politicians wouldn't have got along with him very well, and honestly, I wouldn't have either. I don't mix well with strict, regimented people. When trying to accomplish a goal, I go with the path of least resistance, and when changes happen, then I change and adapt to the new path of least resistance, still going to the same place. But a man like him is going to sit down and have a plan that at 4:45 this is going to happen, at 5:15, and have a real my way or the highway approach to things. So I pretty well disagree with the all-powerful state approach to things, primarily because who controls the state? Who watches the watchmen? You're seldom going to find a leader that excels in all areas of life. And you don't want your mechanic running the ER or your doctor working on your car. And that's probably the biggest problem we have in America today is the people running the country are all lawyers. They're the most notoriously seedy people on earth. So why is a lawyer telling a doctor what they can and can't do? I actually do agree in his stance that the state should be involved in business, but only in a radical restructuring of things. I think that automobiles, cell phones, whenever you come across an invention like that, the internet, social media, something that everybody on earth should have to stay on an even playing field, then great. Let the people that developed all this stuff just get filthy rich, but then it needs to turn into a utility. I mean, we should have at least two more branches of government, one for manufacturing and commerce, one for, internet and information. But the only way that can ever be fair and balanced is that the people running those industries can't make anything off of it. And I mean strict, bad punishment for breaking that law. I mean, come on, a representative making a couple $100,000 a year is now a 100-millionaire. People leave office broke, steal the furniture and the artwork, and then go on tour getting $1 million for a speaking engagement. We shouldn't have any of that going on. Anyway, I liked his takes on the isms, and I wish that we could get to that stage. He correctly identified the problems. That's something that we are yet to be able to do on a mass scale. So I can definitely respect him for making a stand and calling a spade a spade. But it seems like he might have gone a little too far in the other direction with the whole imperialistic state. This is another one of those subjects that have been so heavily propageed, it's hard to know what the truth of the matter is. But what I want to know is, were the people happier and better off afterwards? We just hear Il Duce bad because he went against the people that control our newspapers and textbooks. For all I know, that could have been the golden era of Italy. Anyway, I found it interesting and kind of refreshing to hear the public addressed as adults. So I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll see you on the next one. Static out.